Hello, welcome to Soul Sessions. This is season number 4.
All right.
We have a new season, we have a new series, and we're in a new place and a new time. Lots of newness today.
Yeah, so we wanted to start off this new season with something special. And Buddhism for us has been that kind of special philosophy that has played a big role in our work.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we first met, you were going to the Buddhist Center in Denver, and you took me there, and you said, now there's going to be deities on the walls, and you thought I was going to be freaked out by it, and I said, I've seen it all. And we used to go to every Wednesday they would have a meditation night, and it was really wonderful.
Yeah, it was I wouldn't say it was my first experience with meditation, but certainly one of the most profound and intensive practices that I've done. Anyways, so we've been talking about these different approaches to the divine, and if you've noticed, they all lead to the same place. They take different approaches. Yes, some work with the intellect, some work with the emotions, devotion. Others work through action, through selfless action in the world. But they all have one thing in common, is that they're teaching us how to disidentify ourselves with the ego. When we over-identify with this ego, with this persona, as Jung would say, we become very limited. We're very self-centered. We become...
And self-critical, and we're always like analyzing ourselves.
Exactly. And it leads to what the Buddha called suffering. So we'll start there, kind of talking about how do we create our own suffering? Why do we create this suffering? And then maybe a little bit of what we can do.
We won't leave you there.
No, because we're going to do a series on Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about how to transcend this ego level of suffering.
And suffering is the topic for today, because it's everyone's favorite topic. But it really is, it gets to the root of why we seek spirituality, why we seek coaches and therapists and helpers in the world, because we're suffering in some way. And there's extent, some people suffer a lot from like big things, and other people are suffering from a lack of meaning. And so there's a lot of, the world is full of it, and we're going to talk about that. So let's start with with Buddhism. We want to talk about the difference between a religion and a philosophy. And I didn't really, I was raised Catholic, so I thought, well, if you're studying Catholicism or Christ, it's a religion. It's not, I didn't think of it as, it's a philosophy or a way I can apply. I don't have to be Christian to understand Jesus's teaching. So it's the same thing with Buddha. It's not, you don't have to become a Buddhist to use those, the teachings of the Buddha.
Yes, so...
But you can, if you want to become a Bodhisattva, you can.
Absolutely. So Vivekananda puts it very nicely. He says, religion has 3 things: a philosophy, a mythology, and a ritual, or let's say a set of rituals. So if you look at Catholicism, you see there's a rooted philosophy that comes from the Greeks and from Jewish law and tradition. They have a set of rituals, of course. Baptism,
go to church,
going mass,
penance.
Of course. Jung loved the whole Catholic practices because he saw a lot of the pagan traditions carried on in Catholicism. And then the mythology, of course, which if you're a Catholic, you don't consider it mythology, you consider it part of the history of the church.
Yeah.
But the mythology of Jesus. And,
born of a virgin.
Yeah.
He died on the cross for our sins. He created miracles. He was a special God-like character, and so his teachings became very sanctified in that Christian.
Absolutely, and they all now combined. I mean, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So when you combine all those three elements, you get religion, which is more than the sum of those elements.
Which is psychologically a very powerful tool for change, because if you really believe, I mean, it really, look, if there's so many religions, so you can't say one is better than the other, but if you really believe in it, it can have a transformation in your life.
Yes. But if we look at the philosophy, then we're taking a certain part of that.
We're not doing all the rituals. We're not, you could believe in like the beautiful sayings of Jesus without having to go to church, or doing the, going through baptism and all those things, and then practicing and repenting and all those ideas, or even believing in the myth. You could say, wow, that person was wise. I believe he existed. The same thing with Buddha. The Buddha, did he sit in front of the Bodhi tree and have this, enlightenment experience? What his myth? Do you have to go and do the sit with the sangha and the pujas, like attend the pujas and do all these rituals, or can you look at Buddha, what he taught, and say, that can apply in my life. This makes a lot of sense. So that's the difference between philosophy and religion. That's a really good way to look at that. Yes.
And then when we look at the philosophy, Buddhist philosophy really came of age, and it was developed by the Buddha himself in an age of consciousness. We can draw a direct line in his philosophy to the Upanishads, to the Vedas, although some practitioners of Buddhism would say, no, that's not correct, because, again, it's a religion for them, and we're simply talking about the philosophy. So if you look at his philosophy, definitely tied to that whole culture of the Vedas. It's coming directly from it. It's one of the schools that grew out of the Vedas. The important part about that is that in a consciousness paradigm, he was not talking about a material universe. And that's the big difference in these paradigms. If you read Buddhism today, just Buddhist philosophy, from a materialistic perspective, you're going to get the wrong interpretation.
Well, even the way Christ taught, I'm assuming he wasn't thinking of a material a philosophy anyway, but everyone took it that way.
Exactly.
So
yes. And so what that means is that in that consciousness paradigm, the basic element of existence, of creation, anything you see in the universe is awareness, consciousness, not the other way around. For, let's say, from the materialistic perspective, when you look at objects in the universe, you're saying what is fundamental about that experience is material, matter. If you reduce it down to its elements, matter is at the heart of it. In a consciousness paradigm, it's the opposite. What is irreducible about that experience is the awareness, consciousness, that space of being aware of something is the foundation of existence. So very different paradigms, and I encourage you to, even if you don't buy into it, to ask yourself, what if the universe existed this way, in this consciousness way, instead of a material way? Instead of these solid objects that we have to move around that are permanent, and we're going to get into that today with the impermanence. So the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism is life is suffering. As soon as you're born, you're going to die. Like your life is not forever, and so in that itself, we age, we get sick, and we die. So life is suffering already.
But there's a cause for that suffering. And there's a way out of that suffering. And the way is what Buddha called the Eightfold Path.
That's right. So let's begin with the suffering question.
Yeah.
And we all know that, when we hear suffering, we think, well, yeah, pain, illness, death, all those things. But that's not really what the Buddha meant. In his philosophy, if you read it carefully and you consider his perspective, he's saying that there's this unsatisfactory experience in our craving, in our desire for things, that we desire things and we expect them to make us happy, but that there's always this sense of dissatisfaction. It's like a little pebble in our shoe. No matter how much we consume, no matter how much we get and acquire, we're still dissatisfied.
Well, yeah, because if we get they say the worst thing that can happen is getting what you want. Because when you get what you want, it doesn't last. So you feel this like fear, and then when you don't get what you want, you have suffering. So it's almost like a trap if your mind is identifying with something external to make you feel good. A great example of this is, we've all experienced this. You experience more joy and excitement and happiness the day before your vacation, before the day it starts. And that's because because it's this anticipation, and we're like looking forward to it, and we're excited thinking about it's coming up. And then when it happens, oh no, I only have 6 days left. Oh no, it's going so fast. Oh no, I want to get everything out of this vacation before then you start thinking about going back to work. And so that in itself, vacation is supposed to be happy, but the happiness is misplaced and the joy is misplaced. And that's what we're talking about suffering. It's not like, of course there's big suffering in the world and wars and terrible things that happen, but even in our everyday life, it's that kind of dissatisfaction. Well, that the mind creates, the ego mind creates.
Yeah, and he would say that the catastrophes that we see in the world are the accumulation of all that, the beginning of that, right? Which are the seeds in our own approach to things, that we expect these things to give us happiness, wrong in a let's say in a faulty way. We're not perceiving reality as it really is, and therefore we are in error in essence. And that accumulation of all those small little errors then create what we call wars and
collective human experience.
The catastrophe of human nature.
So there is suffering. The cause of suffering then is the ego.
Yeah.
The identification with the ego. And the ego is the sense of I, me, mine. And we perceive ourselves as separate from the world, and that the objects in the world are things that we need to attain. And then that it's like getting new clothes. If I get that car, I'll feel good. If I get that partner, I'll feel good. If I have this amount of money in the bank, if I get that promotion, if I get rid of my illness, I'll feel good. And then this whole concept of the I is, it's never okay. It's like we're always aging. We're always moving toward this dissatisfaction with whatever we have. And so what makes the ego create suffering?
Yes, so it's a fundamental error based on our perception. So the fundamental error is this, that we see the world and we think it's separate from us. It's a dualistic perception, that we think I am inside my head observing the world, but the world is out there separate from me. If I close my eyes, I go away, the world continues the way I've experienced it, but without me.
It's like you drop into the world and it's like you're separate from this machine that's happening and not feeling connected to it.
Yes, and that is a misperception. It is a fundamental error that we make based on our human nature. And that's what Buddha was talking about. He says, if you just go by your sensory experiences you're going to fall into this fundamental error, believing that you are the ego, you are this separate self that is experiencing something that is occurring outside yourself, in a sense.
So I heard a great, I was reading Adi Shankara, who was also around the time of Buddhism, and Buddhism came of Vedanta. He said it's like the cutting of a skin. We think, oh, my skin got cut. So if you identify with the mind and the body, that this is me, this is my skin, it's painful. But if you look at a tree, he said, and you cut the tree branch off, you don't identify with the tree. You don't say, that's me. You say, that tree. So there's no suffering in that. So it's really it feels weird like to say, well, I'm not a tree. I'm a person in this body. It's that kind of attachment that I am this body. I am this ego that keeps us suffering even when things happen to us. Yeah. And we hang on to that, oh, I got cut a while ago, where the tree is like, I'll just grow another limb. Like the tree is not fazed by it as much as the ego is. It doesn't have an ego like we have.
Yeah, one of the fundamentals of Buddhist philosophy is this idea of no self. And it extends into this kind of idea that, okay, maybe he was talking about the Hindu or Vedic idea of this soul. But he was very much a psychologist. In other words, he was talking about our immediate experience and our everyday experiences. And so I read it more as he was talking about the ego self. There is no real self, because if you think about it,
ego self.
Yeah, ego self. If you think about this self, where do you find it? Do you find it in your experience of things? In your perceptions, in your emotions? Like,
is this hand is part of your body? Do you say, this hand is me? If they cut off your hand, would that be you? No, there's something else. And it's like, am I the 7-year-old? Am I the 10-year-old? Am I the baby?
That's right.
And we're going to we have a whole thing on no self, so we're
going to talk more about that. But this no self, again, the fundamental error makes us feel like there is a solid I, a solid ego in us that is observing the world and experiencing it separately from our mind, in essence.
And I always say, like, at our clients and our students, that when they're working with people and creating their life and changing their getting them out of that suffering, that the only problem, like, oh, my mother did this to me, or this happened to me, I have to build my confidence. It's like, no, the only problem you have to solve is that everything that causes all the unhappiness in your life is you believe you're the ego. That's everything. And if you can remember that, and then even in our trainings we say, where are you bringing the client? You're always bringing them to either build up the ego, which is very, like, it's almost like increasing suffering in a way, or you're moving them away to individuate, as Jung would say, away from the ego. And that's why I love how Jungian psychology works really well with Eastern philosophy, because he had the same idea, but he came from another place, and then he started looking into the Eastern philosophy, and around that time Eastern wisdom started coming to the US and to Europe, and so 1900s. So there was a lot of this, like, merging of East-West at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, Buddhism has been very influential in the West, a lot more than people understand and believe, because it even goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks came in contact with Buddhist philosophy through Alexander the Great when he went into India. Buddhism was very powerful at that time, and some of the Greek philosophers that went to India then brought it back to Greece and to the West.
So there is suffer. Life is suffering. Number 2 is there is a cause for that suffering, and that's the identification with the ego, and then the way out of that suffering. And someone made a comment, why don't you talk about how to create joy? And I want to just say this: one of the most amazing, this is going to change your life, we don't have to create joy. The joy is already within us. the identification with the ego just puts a veil over the joy. It's underneath it. So it's something we have to manufacture or create. It's our natural state. And so he said, if you take a glass of water and you put dirt into it and you stir it up, it appears that the water is dirty. And he said, but that's not true. If you look under a microscope, you see that the water molecules are separate from the dirt molecules. They've never been touched. But it's that appearance of dirtiness, the appearance of suffering, but there's joy already there, we just can't see it. And he said when this sediment settles to the bottom of the glass, the water's naturally clear. And when we meditate, that's actually what we're doing, and we're doing these practices of letting go of the ego. We're purifying our mind so the noise can settle, and the joy will naturally arise from that. So we don't have to manufacture it. We don't have to create it. We don't have to do things to create joy, except it's more of letting go and allowing the joy to naturally arise.
Yeah.
So I always remember that metaphor because it's so clear. It's like, yeah, it appears to be dirty, but it's not.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about Buddhists. Sorry to interrupt you. That they give a lot of great metaphors and stories to help you understand, because these concepts, the ego is going to block you from understanding those concepts.
Yeah, that's essentially it. Again, going back to that dualistic perception that we have of us and the world. If it is not that, right? If it's not dualistic, it's non-dual. So Buddhist philosophy is non-dual at heart, which means that everything you're perceiving is the same as your awareness of it. Now, this is a very different perceptual reality than what we experience in our everyday, because again, these objects that we see in the world, other people, events in our life, the universe in general, appears to us to be outside of us. The reality, Buddha is saying, is that everything is within that awareness. Everything is your consciousness. There is no separation. So why does he talk about compassion? Because it is the ultimate reality that when you see somebody suffering, you're seeing an aspect of yourself suffering. When you're seeing somebody hurt, you're seeing an aspect of yourself that's hurt. So the way you work with the world, the way you are in the world, is this very different way that you're taking care of the world, because
it's you are the world.
Exactly.
As Michael Jackson would say.
Maybe he was a Buddhist.
You are the world. Remember that song?
Yeah, so it's a very different way of being in the world.
You know what I love about that? I just say that, especially now the world is so divided, and it's like we can't really resolve our problems by being against someone else. The only way we can resolve it is through the practice of seeing that we're not separate. That what we see in other people, and Jung says what irritates us about others is really pointing us to ourselves. And what also the joy others feel, it's your joy too. You're just not having a personal experience of it right now. But it is your experience. But the perception that you're the ego and that person's separate is us versus them. And that's what really creates suffering.
Yeah, and so as humans, and he boils it down to this, right? When they asked him, what is your teaching about? What is it really about? He says, all I'm teaching is suffering and the cessation of suffering, meaning the end of suffering. Because he says, as long as you hold on to that perception of me and the world, that dualistic nature of our perception, you'll always be creating your own suffering, because you're not seeing things clearly. You're in that fundamental error. So as you correct it, as you start to see that everything, all sentient beings, like he says, are worthy of compassion because they are you, then you start to see that, okay, if nature is hurting, that's part of me. If I hurt,
the earth is connected to us.
Yeah. If I throw trash in the river, if I hurt an animal, I'm hurting myself in some way. And that understanding is really based on perceiving a deeper reality of things, the interconnectedness of things.
And it really does, that us versus them kind of thing, or competition, or I'm right and you're wrong, those kind of things, and even in families, like to see that, any conflicts that arise, it's like I'm seeing myself in those people. And Jung talks about this with the shadow and the projection, and even psychology talks about this. So like you said, the Buddha was a psychologist, and really to understand that. And I think the hardest part is, it's easy to think, ooh, I'm that famous person, or I'm like Oprah, who's so wise, or I'm this, wise teacher. But it's hard to look at people that are bad and wrong and say they're like me too. I think that's the bigger thing, right? It's the people that give us the trouble, and the or perceive to give us trouble, are the ones that are our greatest teachers, and hardest to love.
Yeah, and here you see something fundamental about Buddhism, that he's not saying, oh, you have to develop this compassion and this love for others artificially or from the ego. Mm-hmm. Like I'm in my head, and those people are separate, but I have to be loving and kind towards them. No, that's not what he means. He means you have to change your perception to where you see them as yourself.
Like you're not pretending to see, like you said, you're not pretending to give compassion. Like I'm the better person because I study Buddhist philosophy, so I'm going to send you love. And it's kind of like that, almost like it's not real, true, that's coming from the ego, that I'm wise and you're not. And we don't want to have that kind of mentality. We want to really see that it's us.
Right, and then you're acting compassionately, not because a philosophy or a religion tells you should be that way. Mm-hmm. You're being that way because you see its reality. Mm-hmm. You see that it's the fundamental way of being, that it is the way to be in the world. So it's a very different approach. And again, if we read it from a materialistic perspective, we can only deduce this kind of, oh, I have to be kind because it's these rules or commandments. But when you see it from the non-dual perspective, you're understanding that, oh, it's because that's the way it truly is.
So it's sort of like when I first started doing this practice of Tonglen, they say taking on the suffering of others. And it kind of created something like kind of the opposite of what I intended. And I asked the nun, and she goes, she had a British voice, and she was like, Deborah, were you just pretending to do that? And I was like, why? And she's like, it's that attachment to, you're doing it to get something. Like you're doing it to make the world different. I'm going to send them love so they change, or I'm going to send them love so I can not have this experience anymore. But what we really want to do is do this as a practice so we know who we are. Like the goal is really self-realization versus manifesting something. And so for me, I was doing it from a manifestation, like if I take this on, then this won't happen to me again. And then what happened was the thing happened again, and I said, what is going on here? I'm like making it bigger when I brought it on. And so it's because my ego took it on, and my ego was trying to get rid of something by using this practice. And so that's where I see a lot of people, and I myself am fall trapped to this idea that you use the spiritual principles to work and manipulate the material world, but the spiritual practice is really self-realization. And then you're not as attached to what happens in the world and what shows up. Yeah. So the Eightfold Path, do you want to review it really quick, or no?
I don't have them memorized.
Okay. So it's a practice of Buddhism. It's like right knowledge, right action.
Yeah, it's pretty much following the Buddhist teachings. Okay. And absorbing the philosophy. But
you don't have to follow all of them to reduce your suffering in the world by just. What Jung taught in his idea of individuation is very similar to the Buddhist practice of letting go, seeing your projection of your shadow, the parts that you don't see about yourself in others, seeing that and realizing that they're you and that everything is you, and that actually you're more than that. Like there's this other bigger self that's
Yeah.
beyond just these personality traits that you are.
Yeah, because what we saw after kind of initiating our relationship through this Buddhist philosophy.
Ooh, I like that, initiating the relationship.
Was that if we try to apply these very deep, beautiful concepts in Buddhism and Eastern philosophy directly, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because we're living in a world, in a material world, right? Where the paradigm, its primary paradigm is materialism, meaning everyone around us, with almost without exception, has bought into this materialistic paradigm. And as human beings, we tend to synchronize our point of view with the group that we associate with.
It's like a bubble, a confirmation, like a
Yes.
cognitive bias in a way. You're seeing things from that materialistic, and you're studying Buddhism from that materialistic standpoint, and it's...
Or even if you're not,
Yeah.
as soon as you go out there and interact with work people, offices, and
You sink back
social
into it.
groups, you're back to the materials.
Sucks you back in.
Yes. And so what we saw was that we needed a more practical, personal psychology to begin to decondition our mind around this false perception. And Jung's shadow work does that. It's a perfect way to approach your mind in a very personal way, because he's talking about what triggers you, what are your dreams telling you, what's coming up for you in your personal experiences, but then pointing to the fact that all these things are arising from your own mind, which is pretty much a Buddhist philosophy as well.
I really like that. And I, when I first started, I was a hypnotherapist, doing this work in personal development. And it was all about reprogramming. I got to reprogram the ego so it's more confident and more positive and repair the past of my ego's story and reframe it and all those things, which is good for, I think, the first level. But what we're talking about here is something the next level of evolution for people is that you can build up, you need a strong ego to do this kind of work. But there's a time where you have to let it go. You have to let go of the ego, that identification with I'm a good person, I'm a smart person, I'm a beautiful person, I'm a kind person, and or that I'm not good enough even, the identification with things that you aren't sure of yourself, and see that there's something bigger than just this little I. And I think one of the ways we can start doing that is, I love the concept of impermanence that Buddhism teaches, is this, that nothing ever lasts. When my dad died, I remember we were waiting, it was the day before the funeral at my mom's house, and we were getting old pictures together of him, and like his whole life I saw, like him as a little boy, and then all our Christmases together, and us as little kids, and we were all like 40s and 50s, or his children grown up, and all the passages of time. And the thought came to me is, you can't hang on to anything. Life keeps moving. It's that Pema Chodron calls it the groundlessness of life, and that the ego resists that, and it's that suffering that we can't accept, that people leave and things change and we're getting older and money goes in and out, and it's like we're always trying to grasp the world and try to hold on to it. And it was really it just made me realize how little I was in the present moment in my life. How much I didn't cherish those moments, because we assume they're always going to be there. We can always go back home for Christmas. We can always go back to that day, being a little kid, and the night before Christmas Eve. I don't know if you remember in your house, but for me it was like, anticipation and believing in Santa, believing in these things we did as kids. And then we lose that childlike idea as we become adults, and it's like who we are just keeps evolving and changing. So in a way that it's sad that we can't hang on to everything, but in also a way it's good, because we can always reinvent ourselves. We're never stuck anywhere because the life keeps moving. And the only thing that that needs to be, that we hang on to, is the things that we want to. And when we do, that's what causes us suffering. We hang on to things that happen to us, or how our parents screwed us up, and how, those things cause suffering. Not the thing that causes actually more suffering than the actual event that people experience, because they hang on to it.
Yeah, and as long as we hang on to those imprints from the past, we're caught. We're caught in that sense of ego. In other words, that separateness, that we see others, the world, separate from us, and that we are separated. That's the ego, essentially. It's an experience. It's not a part of our brain. It's not really anything solid in our mind. It's simply like a function that automatically takes us to this sense of separateness.
It's like it's a concept that's always evolving. It's a concept of ourself that's always evolving, but it's not real.
Yes, it functions very well for survival, because you take care of yourself. In essence, you're looking out for yourself. But once we get into higher realms of social interaction, spiritual questions, it doesn't work very well, because we're stuck in that, we're encapsulated in our past and personal experiences. So all these spiritual traditions, all these practices, including Jungian psychology, which is really a spiritual psychology, is pointing to a way of dissolving our ego. Not aggressively getting rid of it, but working with it so that we can understand the true nature of our mind. Like you say, that happiness that's already there, the peacefulness, the clear light of our awareness, it's there, but it's covered over by our misperception of the world, our ego.
So what we're saying is that the external events and the situations in our life, the only reason why we suffer is because we identify or label it as that. We give it name and form, and we say that is a bad thing, this is a good thing. And most of what we perceive of the world is from our past conditioning, from that ego kind of remembering, which is, like you said, good for survival. Like putting your hand on a hot stove is, don't do that, it's bad. When I jump in the ocean and it's 80 degrees, it's beautiful and comfortable. But when it's 60 degrees, it's a little chilly and it's uncomfortable. And so we have those kind of mechanisms to help us remember the pleasant and the unpleasant. But then think about all the accumulation of all our life. Our mind has accumulated all these stories about what's pleasant and unpleasant. And we just we just react to the world. And we're just not free because we're just being pulled around. And when I realized this with Buddhism, actually studying this, is that idea that everything is not as real as it seems. Everything is not as negative as it seems. Like we have this assumption that this, kind of a hard black and white thinking, and to be open to this could actually be good, or there's some joy in this. And there's a great story of two monks and the Buddhists walking down out in the field through the forest or whatever they're at, and they come across a river, like a small river, but it's rushing water. And there's a maiden, a young woman, standing at the river like she was afraid to cross it. So one of the monks picked her up, carried her over with the other monk, and dropped her off at the river. And then an hour later, the monks were walking in silence, and then all of a sudden the other monk who didn't pick her up said, I'm so mad at you. How could you have broken your vows? We're not supposed to be touching women, and this is bad, and I can't believe you risked everything you should have left her there. And the other monk looked at him and he goes, I put her down an hour ago. Why are you still carrying her? And so that's this concept of these things that happen in the moment, and then we carry them in our mind, and they continue to torture us, and we're really just torturing ourselves. It's the event happened, and then we continue to try to torture ourselves and blame other people and want to get even and want to have a good comeback, and this kind of stewing of the mind, and it's just making us suffer. And if we know that we could just put it down, we'd naturally feel joy. But it's not as easy as it seems.
No, it is a process.
It's a practice, right?
A practice, that's a good way to put it, of course, because that's what the Buddha was getting at. That if indeed our suffering is caused by our misperception, which is our mind, then the answer is to work with our mind. We have to be able to work with our mind. If we don't, then we're caught in our past experiences, in our conditioning, in our karma. And that, he says, is basically the condition of most human beings on the planet. They're caught in their personal experiences, and they're projecting those personal experiences onto the world and thinking the problem is out there. It's these other people that are making me suffer or causing the problems, not me. That's the ego.
And so you have like two people having the same experience, say like an event that happened that maybe set them back. Maybe both of them, their parents got divorced, and then one of them continues to suffer in relationships and say, love doesn't last, and repeat the pattern. And then the other person uses that to find a way to find love. And so the event itself did not cause the suffering. It's the mind around the event, the perception of the event, and how far that person's carrying it that creates the future of the person and their life. And, you could look at your siblings. Some people, and I think genetically, some people have a more positive attitude than others. So we get a lot from our family of how to perceive the world, and it's kind of passed down from generation. But everyone has the opportunity to be free. No matter what happened to you, everyone has the opportunity to have joy in their life, no matter what circumstances.
Yeah. And, when after Buddha awakened himself through meditation under the Bodhi tree, he walked to the nearest village and wanted to teach people. He decided, this is a good path. Let's try to teach people this idea of the mind, how to end suffering. And somebody runs up to him, I think it was a kid, ran up to him and asked him, because he appeared so differently, asked him, are you a god? And he says, no, I'm not a god. Are you an angel?
Because he was glowing, right?
I'm not an angel. What are you? And he says, I'm simply awake. And by implication, that means that most of us are asleep.
Asleep at the wheel on autopilot.
Yes, we're asleep again to the true reality of things, to the oneness of things, to the non-dual nature of things. In our sleep, we're dreaming. We're dreaming our own personal experiences, and we're thinking these personal experiences is how the world is. But we're simply seeing our own reflection in the world. It's like a mirror. And Jung, of course, explains this through the projections of the shadow, that we project the things that we've repressed, forgotten, held in our personal unconscious. We project them onto the world, and we think, I'm seeing reality as it is, but we're simply seeing our own mind. The way to undo that, the way to free ourselves from that encapsulated experience is through shadow work. We begin to question that experience. Is this experience really out there, or is it somehow mine? What part am I playing in creating my own suffering, my own joys, my own work experience, my relationship? Everything gives us an entry point into that inner world through shadow work. And the idea, of course, is integration, meaning we accept it as us. The more we accept of our experiences as us, the more we're seeing reality as it is. We're seeing the oneness. We're seeing the non-dual nature of reality.
And I think it really helps to see the things that we find irritating about others. Like, I think it's so powerful to look at that because it's really a part of ourselves that we judge, or else we wouldn't be triggered. Like, there's a part of me that can be like that, but I'm not acknowledging it. And so, but most people, like doing the work of shadow work and individuation, you start to ask yourself the question of, why is this person triggering me? What is it about this feeling? We have a process we take people through, but for the ordinary person, it's that person's bad. I'm shutting them out of my life, or I got to fight to get this person to, listen to me and do what I say. And, it's kind of like this external power that you're projecting onto the person. And then when you realize, oh, this is in my mind, it feels like the world just finds a way to resolve itself. It finds a way to, like, I remember, so many times, like, I've had a conflict with myself, but it appeared as if someone else was having the conflict. And I worked on it with myself, and then it automatically was kind of resolved itself. Like, the person would come back and be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be that way." I'm like, "Wow, that I didn't even have to tell that person that we're inappropriate, or I just had to work with my own self." And then the person would magically change, and maybe they were never the way that I perceived them to be, and they were naturally that way. That's what happens. The ego creates that filter, and then we don't really see a person for who they are. And that's, I think, why a lot of people practice in Buddhism and yoga the practice of namaste, that the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. And if that's a beautiful practice, even when someone is really irritating you, or you get really angry at someone, or someone's angry at you, you have to kind of put yourself as seeing beyond their persona, beyond their reactions, beyond their triggers, is that somewhere in them is just like you, a divine person, and you are divine. And connecting on that level resolves all the illusion on the surface, that we're battling these illusions that are not even real.
Yeah. So we hope you see that why the Buddha emphasized suffering, because we have to understand its nature. You cannot end suffering if you don't understand what it is, how it arises in our mind, how it takes over our lives, and how we experience it. And it's pointing to our mind. Therefore, in the second part of the series, we're going to be talking more about the mind and how to work with it.
I think this releases tension, and you can feel more at peace with yourself and the world. Yeah. It's like when we're caught up in the delusion of the ego, it's like the world is so big and we're trying to, like, wrestle it, pull all the strings. And when we're at peace, it's like everything just kind of flows, and it's just this, you don't need to fix anything, and yourself mostly. One question that came up earlier was, how do you tell someone that they're creating their own suffering? How do you tell someone, because you see your friends and those of you who are coaches or teachers, you understand a lot of these concepts, and you think, well, how do I tell my best friend or my mother or my sister, this is your suffering, like, you're creating it yourself? Because a lot of people would be resistant to that.
Absolutely. Well, it is a process, so you have to remember, you start where they're at.
Yeah.
You're not going to convince them by simply stating it, but you have to kind of enter their world and help them with the particular situation that they're in. What is this trigger about? What is this problem about? Why is it bothering? Why is it such an issue? And then you help them kind of grasp that the nature of that problem, how it's connected to their own mind, their own perception of things. That's the best way, because it leads them to their own understanding of the nature of suffering. And that's what you want. You want them to have their direct experience of it.
And just like gardening, you can plant the seed in a fertile ground, or you can plant the seed in dry earth. And if they have that dry, hard earth where they're not really ready to hear it yet, you could still plant the seed. But you'll notice that some people are more ripe and more fertile for this idea and ready to be free, and other people want to keep suffering. So it's like they hang on to it as a way to hang on to their identity. And the ego has a natural defense mechanism against self-actualization, because it knows once you let go of the ego, it kind of loses its power, it loses itself, and you become something else. And that's scary to the ego. So it has that natural mechanism. So it's not that you're not doing it right, or you're not sharing it right, and it can be frustrating, but just trust, and you hold that person in the image of becoming. And again, you'll tell someone this and it'll just change their world. And other people you'll tell, and it's like a seed floating on the top of hard earth. It needs some more rain. It needs some more mud. It needs some more nutrients. It needs to sink down a little deeper for them to finally get it. But it's a beautiful process. I think one of the greatest ways for people to realize they're not the ego is through the shadow work that we do in our coach training. Really, really powerful. Because in 15 minutes, you ask people questions that will basically break apart their arguments where they're basically giving the answers, and it's like a self awakening that the person goes through when that happens. They actually realize it themselves. So with this kind of work where you're really helping someone let go of the ego, it's all about them. They have to get it. It comes from inside. Like there's a part of them that's already aware, but so you can't like kind of pile on the information and expect them to just realize it. It has to come from within themselves, and asking that inquiry, asking those questions.
Yeah, and I think the Buddha would say, if you really want to help people, you have to free your mind first. You always have to work with your own mind. We cannot really help the world if we're just one more angry person out there, or one more frustrated person, or scared.
We're frustrated with a frustrated person.
Yes, we have to be awake. We have to awaken ourselves. Once you're awake, then you can really help others. Then the world will benefit from your human life, your human experience.
Yes. So next week, we will be back here on the East Coast, and we will be broadcasting 11 a.m. Eastern on Fridays. And the next topic is the Matrix in Buddhism. And a lot of people think the Matrix, the movie, but the Matrix, the movie, actually was the people that developed it studied Buddhism. So it's based on Buddhism. Buddhism isn't based on the Matrix, the movie. So, but we're talking about the Matrix. That word is really it's the web of consciousness.
Yeah.
And how we work with it. Can the ego refer to the lower brain? I don't know. I would say the ego is more than just the brain. Yeah, I mean, it is a survival element, but there's also social elements to the ego. That is, other parts of the brain help the social elements, because there's physical survival and then there's social survival, where I can't be embarrassed, I can't be ashamed, and all those guilt.
Yes. Yeah, it depends on what you mean by the lower brain. If you mean like the basic human functions, breathing, hunger, sleep, that would be, I would say, pre-ego, right? Because we could do those things without our sense of I. Animals, in a sense, that's how they live, very unconsciously, just going by their instincts.
Well, here's a really great example of that. People with Alzheimer's. They don't remember who they are, so they don't have really an ego. So they would be operating from that low, just functioning and.
Yes. And if you notice, even a genius can have a very powerful ego and be caught up, be kind of in a trance through that ego, through that I. So it doesn't have much to do with intelligence. You can be very intelligent and still be very caught up in this ego.
Great question. So we'll see you next week. Thank you for joining us, and hope you're having a happy summer, staying cool, and we will see you soon.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Stay well.